Perfect. Can you see all right over there, Peter?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
long distance.
Okay, perfect.
I can see better.
Mark, can you hear us all right?
I'm sorry?
Mark, can
Yeah.
you hear us okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, if I may, I'm just going to introduce Mark, who is very kindly speaking for us today from United States. Mark is really an extensive author, really, on naval history in general, but interestingly, on 18th century naval history of Britain, including specifically the campaign that leads to the Battle of the Glorious 1st of June. And he had written the Osprey work on that battle. Actually, I don't think in general there have been that many specific works on the battle. So this is actually one of the rare number. But Mark's book on the battle, on the Osprey work is tremendous and beautifully illustrated. And I'm rather looking forward to seeing the many slides that we've got as part of the talk this afternoon, because I think they're going to be very interesting. So if I may, I'm going to hand over to you, Mark, to tell us a little bit about this this campaign and the battle that was the culmination of it. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay. I'm assuming everyone can hear me there. I'd like to thank you folks for inviting me. This is literally the first time I've given a talk to anyone on your side of the pond. So, and again, my talk is about the glorious 1st of June. Come on. And what's interesting is it was a battle that went by a whole bunch of different names. Glorious 1st of June is the one that it is best known as. And of course, that's the name the British gave it. And as they say, victors write the histories. But it's also called the Fourth Battle of Ushant, even though it was fought more than 1,000 miles away from Ushant. And the French called it Bataille du 13 Prairial en Tout, or the 13th day of Prairial, which was their new calendar, in the year 2. Because, of course, when you have a revolution, that means that everything starts fresh and everything prior to that can be ignored. We see that even today. And finally, they also called it Combat de Prairial because it wasn't just a single battle. And the glorious 1st of June was different in many ways from most sailing battles and really from most naval battles as well. It was the only sailing era fleet action fought on the high seas, probably 1,000 miles or more from the nearest land. It was also the largest fleet action and the most even fleet action fought during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the whole period from 1793 to 1816. It was also the only battle in those entire series of wars that could have ended the war. Trafalgar, as decisive as it was, just ensured that the war would continue and that Britain wouldn't be invaded. This action actually could have ended the revolution shortly after it began. And the other interesting thing is that you can't look at the battle on June 1st in isolation. It was part of the Atlantic campaign of May 1794, which explains the French name of the Battle of the month of Prairial. And it was the culmination of a 4-day fleet action. Okay. So in order to understand why we end up fighting in the middle of the Atlantic, you have to look at the whole campaign. And the Atlantic campaign, they call it the Atlantic campaign of May 1794. And there are a lot of moving parts to this campaign, and it was set in motion in the fall and winter of 1793. The actual fighting took place between 10 April and 1 June 1794. And the whole thing was motivated by a food convoy. The French were trying to bring a massive convoy from the Chesapeake to Brest, and the two sides had completely different objectives. The British objective was destroy the French fleet. It was very Mahanian, even before Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote his books, nearly a century before that. The British objective was always get control of the seas and strangle your enemy to death. And that involved destroying the enemy fleet. The French, they didn't care about their fleet. All they wanted to do was get the convoy to France. Background on this, why do we need a food convoy? Well, the French Revolution, which started in 1789, ended up leading to a major European war by 1793. By 1793, revolutionary France had managed to alienate all of Europe, and that's even Spain. Spain was a traditional ally of France. So that's really an outstanding accomplishment if you consider a single nation getting every nation in Europe angry at it. On top of that, the war started in 1793 with the execution of the French king. At that point, literally everyone seemed to declare war on France. But there was a crop failure that year. And that meant that that starvation was imminent particularly in the maritime provinces, which was further disturbed because there was a pro-royalty insurgency in the Maritimes. Now, when there's a crop failure, that generally doesn't mean that crops fail everywhere. That generally means that they fail somewhere. And under normal circumstances, France could have purchased food from elsewhere in Europe. And there were surpluses in other places in Europe, but, kind of like I said, the French managed to alienate everyone else. They were at war with everyone. And the nearest source of food for them was the Americas, not just the United States. But France had colonies in the Caribbean, including rice and sugar colonies. But the problem was, how do you get the food from there to France in the face of a hostile British fleet? Well, not just a hostile British fleet, a hostile Spanish fleet, a hostile Dutch fleet. The Russians too, but they weren't engaging in the French at that point, except maybe in the North Sea. So they couldn't send the ships individually. They needed a convoy. That was the traditional means of getting ships across contested waters. So let's take a look at the two navies involved, which were the Royal Navy and La Marine Nationale. And both of them were long-standing navies. What is interesting, the Royal Navy was the world's largest and well-established. The Marine Nationale was smaller, and it was geographically divided. There was a Mediterranean fleet and an Atlantic fleet. And the two really couldn't get together at this point because, well, Spain was opposing France as well as Great Britain. It was also riven by the Revolution. The French Revolution was anti-aristocratic, and the French Navy was even more aristocratic than its army. What is interesting, though, when you ask most people about the British Navy, the Royal Navy, everyone assumes that it was largely a conscript navy. Also, the British had a very strong infrastructure. They had professional crews, officers, and dockyard workers, while the French, they had reasonable dockyards, but they had a real severe shortage of skilled personnel. The ships that are involved were a design that had matured in the late 1600s. So now, when I was younger in the 1960s and 70s, this was considered unusual that you'd essentially have a design that didn't really change over nearly 100 years. But if you think about it today, kind of makes sense. I mean, we're still flying B-52s, and they're old enough to collect Social Security. So it's kind of the same type of thing. They were made up of square-rigged ships and what are technically called full-rigged ships because they had 3 masts with square sails on them. And they would have a jib sail and either a gaff or a spanker sail on the aftermost mast, the mizzen mast, and jib sails on the foremast. Those are fore and aft sails. Now, what's interesting about that is it's not necessarily the handiest rig, particularly sailing into the wind, but it's one of the most maneuverable rigs that you can have. You can even sail a square-rigged ship backwards if you need to, although the last time that happened in a fleet action was in 1707, I believe, where British Admiral Cloudesley Shovel backed up his line in order to rescue a ship that was in distress. They were armed with batteries of smoothbore guns, and those guns had essentially not changed since the time of the Armada in 1570. They were muzzle-loading guns that fired solid shot. And the more guns you had, the more powerful your ship was. The British had introduced a new innovation called the carronade, which was a short-barreled gun that fired a much heavier ball. That's supposed to have been an extremely inaccurate gun, but in actuality, it was very accurate. It's just that it was deployed improperly. The ships cruised at 5 to 7 knots. The battles were fought at walking speed. And the ships of the line were the heart of the fleet. A ship of the line had at least two complete gun decks with additional guns on the forecastle, which is the bow of the ship, and in the quarter deck or even poop deck area. And they were the heart of the fleets of any nation's fleet. They would fight in a line of battle, nose to tail. And if you didn't break the line, they were hard to overwhelm. These ships were extremely hard to sink with solid iron shot. That would happen during this battle, but that was extremely unusual. If you were ever addicted to maritime thrillers such as those written by Alexander Kent or C.S. Forrester or Dudley Pope, in those books you see ships exploding and sinking at rates that approximate the losses you see in World War II. That simply didn't happen. The ships would just batter each other until one ship or the other surrendered, and the other side would take it over. They had smaller ships, frigates, corvettes, and sloops of war that were used for scouting. Those typically had at least one full gun deck, and they were ocean-going ships. And both sides used similar ships. In fact, they would capture the ship of the other side and end up using them in their own navy. That's why the French had a ship called the Swiftsure, for example, or why the British had so many ships with French names. And those were typically either prize ships that had been captured, or they were named for previously captured ships. The leaders of the fleet, you had Admiral Richard Howe, the first Earl Howe, and let me go back, in charge of the British fleet, and you had Rear Admiral Louis Thomas Villaret de Joyeuse, who was in charge of the French fleet. Howe was one of the most experienced admirals in the Royal Navy at the time. He was 69 when this battle was fought. So that was an extremely old age in those times, especially for an active officer. He had fought in the 7 Years' War and commanded fleets during the Wars of American Revolution. Villaret de Joyeuse was a lot newer. He had been a lieutenant that got jumped up to admiral during the Revolution, and he ended up in charge of the Brest fleet. He also had something that the British didn't have. The Revolutionary French Navy had an innovation that wouldn't be copied again until the 1920 Russian Revolution, to wit, political officers. He was being monitored by Jean-Paul André, who was, Jean-Paul Saint-André, who had been a merchant captain and ended up getting involved politically during the Revolution and was the head of the Maritime Committee in the Revolutionary Council. And of course, since this was such an important action, the government had to keep an eye on Villaret Joyeuse. And so Villaret Joyeuse wasn't just fighting the British. He had to watch out for his own government. This was during the middle of the Reign of Terror. So if he made a mistake, he could literally lose his head over it. So now let's take a look at the men that manned both fleets. Now, if you ask most people, the image of the Royal Navy was that it was made up of pressed men. Except that's not true. The British sailors that fought this battle were largely volunteer, probably about 2/3 of them. And it could have actually been up to 5/6 were volunteers, because there was a big surge in patriotism when the war started, and a lot of men volunteered. Additionally, if you were a plowboy or a laborer, the Royal Navy was a good way to learn a trade and a profession. There were a lot of volunteers that were landsmen that knew nothing about the sea, but knew that if they joined the Royal Navy, they would get meat 5 days a week, regular rations, and pay. Now, you can look at the food that the British sailors ate and wonder, why would that entice anyone? But you have to put it in context. Somebody who is a casual laborer in a town would be lucky to have meat once a week or once every other week. And it's like I said, this was a way to gain professional skills. The fleet that fought in this campaign, 2/3 of them were experienced men. 1/3 were landsmen that had volunteered. None of the inexperienced men were impressed. The only men that the British were impressing at this time, and really through most of this period, were experienced mariners. Many of the men that ended up getting impressed ended up being rated as petty officers, or even, quickly moved to leadership positions, because the British would impress only to fill gaps in the experience structure of the ship. England also had a professional officer corps. Typically, an officer would go to sea at age 12 to 15 and then spend the rest of his life there. Note that at this period of time, it was an extremely dangerous profession. 1/3 of the officers could expect to die over the course of their careers, and most of that was not from battle. Most of that was from the hazards of the sea. And the men aboard the British ships were extremely well disciplined and were drilled continuously. Now, not all of the British officers were brilliant, as we'll see, because it's the typical problem that at the beginning of the war, you've got a whole bunch of officers that really great during peacetime, but fall short when there's combat. The French matelot. What's interesting is these men were largely conscript. The France had a system where you registered all of the mariners, and during peacetime, and then during times of war, they would draft them into the French Navy. So most of the men that were fighting on the French ships weren't really there voluntarily. They had to be there, which is one of the interesting contradictions, because we think of the British Navy being aristocratic and the French Navy being egalitarian. The French also lacked experienced sailors and officers. Probably no more than a maximum of 1/3 of their crew were experienced. The rest of them were green hands, probably as little as 1/6 on some ships. They also had a scratch officer corps. By this time, very few of the aristocratic officers were still in the French Navy. Many of them had gone overseas. Most of the officers had been petty officers or warrant officers that had been promoted. Many of the commissioned officers that had remained with the Navy now held very, very senior ranks. It wasn't unusual for a lieutenant to end up as an admiral. The result of all of that was they were badly disciplined and badly drilled. The real question that I asked when I started working on the book was, how important was the convoy? Because the French treated it as absolutely decisive. The British didn't really care. But if you're going to do this, how big a factor is it? So now all of these numbers are pretty much swags, just wild guesses on my part. I know that there were between 117 and 170 merchant vessels that were involved. Now, most of these probably were about 300-ton ships. However, there were several fairly large West Indiamen that were carrying sugar and rice from the French colonies. But my guess would be it carried between 35,000 to 51,000 tons of food, and that would have been made up dried foods of all sorts. Sugar and rice from the French colony, grains including rice, but barley, wheat, maize from the U.S., as well as dried fish and salted meat from the United States. This would feed 60,000 to 950,000 people for 4 months. Now, remember that this convoy was motivated by a crop failure. So the crop comes in August and September. We've got about a 4-month gap to fill. Someone can subsist on a pound of dried food a day. So basically, my back of the envelope calculation was that it would feed 600,000 to 950,000. And the population of Brittany in 1794 was about 700,000. In other words, this was enough to feed Brittany and the maritime provinces, or rather, the people that are on your side in Brittany and the maritime provinces, because all of those Vendée rebels can just starve if you're the French government. So the convoy actually was important to France. So let's take a look at the two fleets that were involved in this. The main British fleet was Howe's Channel Fleet. This had 26 ships of the line, 7 frigates, 1 hospital ship, and 5 smaller warships. The 7 frigates and smaller warships were his scouts. They were the ones that he would use to seek out the French fleet. There was also something called Montague's Squadron, which was led by Rear Admiral George Montague, that was made up of 9 ships of the line and 2 frigates. Part of the reason for Montague's Squadron was it was supposed to escort an East India convoy, which was led by Captain Peter Rainier, and it was going from England to the Indies. And it was big. It had 99 East Indiamen. It was escorted by 2 ships of the line, 3 2-decker ships, and a frigate and a sloop. Now, the 2-deckers were smaller 2-deck warships. They were 44-gun and 50-gun. If any of you are familiar with John Bonhomme Richard versus the Serapis, both of those ships were the 2-deckers that I'm talking about. 50 years, 75 years earlier, they would have been used in the line of battle, but by now they were considered too small. Since the British knew that there was a French fleet getting ready to sail, while those 2 ships of the line and 3 2-deckers were adequate to protect it from French privateers in the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, Montague's squadron was supposed to escort them roughly to where the coast of Spain, to protect them from the French fleet. That India convoy would have been a big prize for the French. There were 3 other convoys that were involved. The Newfoundland convoy, which was made up of 3 merchantmen and was escorted by 1 frigate commanded by Captain Thomas Trowbridge, who would become very prominent during these wars. And it was carrying dried fish from Newfoundland to England. There was also a convoy going from Cork in Ireland to England, and that had about 50 merchantmen and was escorted by 2 ships of the line. Finally, the Dutch, which were at war with France, had a convoy going from the Netherlands to Lisbon in Spain, in Portugal, I'm sorry, and it was a frigate and sloop escorted 53 merchantmen. So, what did the French have? The heart of the French fleet was the Brest fleet, commanded by Villarat-Joyeuse. It had 25 ships of the line, 5 frigates, and 3 corvettes. That's the British equivalent of a sloop of war. That was supposed to seek out and escort the food convoy. There was also Cornic's squadron, which was led by Contra-Admiral Yves Cornic, which remained at Brest. It had 8 ships of the line and 1 frigate. There was the food convoy, and that was led by Contra-Admiral Pierre-Jean von Stabel, and he was one of the rare commoners in the Royal Navy, the Marine Royale, and when it became the Marine Nationale, he shot up, and he was escorting the food convoy. He had 3 ships of the line and 1 frigate with him, and of course the 117 to 170 merchantmen. That's kind of the key piece in the whole system. Finally, there was the Roquefort squadron under Contra-Admiral Joseph Marie Neely, and that had 5 ships of the line, 2 frigates, and 4 corvettes. And that was supposed to join the Brest fleet. Now, there was a lot of going to and fro between the Roquefort squadron and the Brest fleet, and you'll see a lot of the French frigates being sent off independently. But that's the playing field. So let's get into the actual campaign. And let's start with the opening moves. The first move was in the fall of 1793. Edmond Charles Genet chartered a bunch of ships and purchased food in the United States to ship to France. Over the winter of 1793 and 1794, the French and U.S. ships gathered in Chesapeake Bay. Now, Chesapeake Bay was a great place for the French convoy to assemble because it was neutral. The British couldn't come in there and raid. If they did, they risked getting the U.S. into the war, and the British really didn't want to do that. It was also the period of the Reign of Terror in France. And again, I've mentioned the impact that had on the Marine Nationale and specifically on the commanders of it, who were all accompanied by political officers. Then on 26 December 1793, Van Stabel's escorts departed France for the Chesapeake. The Roquefort squadron was supposed to reinforce them. Didn't really. They left on 10 April 1794 from Roquefort. And then the very next day, and of course, there are no communications between the 2 sides of the Atlantic. That's something you have to work to understand is they didn't have the instantaneous communications we had today. They didn't have electricity. At night, you went to bed because the only way you could get light was through candles or fires. But it leaves on the 11th of April, 1794. So the next 2 weeks were centered around convoy actions. The Channel Fleet finally sailed on 2 May. Now, Howe was not a believer in keeping his ships at sea. The only time you took your ships to sea was when they were needed. The close blockade of French ports wouldn't start for another 3 years or so. But the East India convoy was leaving, so he decided he would escort it and that they would also check the status of the Brest fleet, because they knew the convoy was going to sail. They didn't know when, but they knew it was going to be sometime after March, because nobody wanted to sail a large convoy of merchant ships during the winter storm season. Nobody wanted to sail it during hurricane season either. But so the point is that April through June was the prime time to get the convoy to France. So 2 days later, the French fleet reaches the Lizard, which is the westernmost part of England, and it parts convoy with the company. And it also, at this point, Montagu's squadron is detached from the Channel Fleet. Neely's squadron has sailed a few weeks earlier, and it has broken up. He has his frigates sailing independently, and they're pretty much scouring the Atlantic trade lanes for British convoys. They found 2 of them, the Cork convoy, and basically the frigates moved in to attack that, discovered there were 2 British ships of the line, and fled. One of the myths is that frigates are faster than ships of the line. The reality is that depending on the wind conditions, any ship can outrace any other ship. And in this case, the French frigates, one of them ended up being caught by a British ship of the line that outsailed it and brought it to action, and the ship surrendered. The officer aboard that was Lanois, who would end up becoming very famous a few years later, operating in the Indies. But he opens the war getting captured by a ship of the line that managed to move faster than his frigate. Neely himself and his ships of the line came across the Newfoundland convoy. And the picture that I've got there is the battle between Neely's flagship, which is an 80-gun ship of the line, and the Castor, which is a 32-gun frigate. So it's not really an even battle. But Trowbridge gave battle in order to give the convoy a chance to scatter and escape. He wasn't terribly successful because the British ended up losing most of the merchant ships. French captured most of them. However, a week later, on the 15th, a bunch of the merchantmen sailing together, 10 of them, sail into Montagu's squadron, who recaptures 10 of them. Finally, to end this opening phase of the campaign, the Brest fleet ended up sailing on 16 May. Now, the thing is that by this time, the British knew that Neely was at sea. Howe has been out in the middle of the Atlantic, and he decides he's going to return to Ushant, which is off Brest, on 16 May. and check the status of the French fleet. When he, shortly after he reached the Lizard, he sent a scout into the harbor, into the bay around Brest, to check the status of the French fleet. And the French fleet was there, and the topmasts were down, which meant it wasn't immediately ready for sea. So at that point, he decides to go chasing Neely. But he hasn't found him, so he returns to Brest on 16 May. And we remember what happened on that day. That was the day the French fleet sailed. And the French and British fleets managed to sail through each other the very next day. I'll show why they didn't engage in the next slide, but basically, Howe reaches Ushant on 18 May, the next day, sends in some frigates to scout, and discovers the French fleet has sailed. He also learns about some of the French attacks on the convoy. So what happened? It turns out the two fleets literally passed each other in the night and in the middle of a big fog bank. And in some cases, they were probably within a few hundred yards of each other. But it was the middle of the night. There was a fog bank. The French fleet heard the British bells and cannon that they were firing in order to keep track of each other. So they silently slipped through each other. What would have been interesting is what would have happened had the two sides discovered each other. Probably you would have had a naval battle at that point. It would have been extremely confused. More of a brawl than a formal naval battle, at the end of which the French fleet would have been completely disorganized, because they were almost disorganized simply getting to sea, and probably would have returned to Brest. And the British probably would have had the freedom to start searching the Atlantic for the convoy. So from the French point of view, this was extremely fortuitous. Well, now the British have realized that the French are out. That's a problem. So he ends up pursuing the French. He knows they're west of him. But as you can see, the red line is the British pursuit. The blue line is the French fleet. And the French are looking for that convoy. They're trying to find it. It literally is a needle in a haystack. But he's, Villeray-Joyeuse is just sailing west, almost in a straight line, while Howe, you can see, is just going all over the place looking for these guys. He ends up sailing west of the French because basically the British could sail faster than the French. He finally encounters them. The French during this time encountered the Lisbon convoy and captured most of the ships, which actually turned out to be an advantage for the British, because Howe is getting his intelligence about where the French are because he recaptures several of the vessels from this Lisbon convoy. He also captures a U.S. ship that the French have made a prize and learns where the French are. He sails north, and he finally finds the French fleet at 15 degrees west. It's, as I said, it's a long way from Ushant. So in the morning of 28 May, the British spotted the French fleet upwind and ahead of them. This shows the initial steps. The British spotted the French fleet. The French fleet at this point is between the British and the convoy. And actually, the convoy is just not quite just south of the French at this point. But the British don't know that the convoy is there because all they can see are the masts of the French fleet. So they form a line of battle, and Howe also orders he had organized his 4 fastest ships of the line into a flying squadron, and he sends them to intercept the French rear. You can see that the direction of the wind has the British beating into the wind, and not only is a stern chase a long chase, but if you are beating into the wind against a fleet that's sailing with the wind, it ends up being very, very long. So finally, Howe orders something called a general chase at 13:45. That's 7 hours later. And basically that means that he's freed all of his ships to go as fast as they can towards the French fleet. At 1800, Bellerophon gets close enough to the trailing French ship of the line, the Revolutionnaire, which was 110, a 3-gun ship of the line, and starts firing at it. It's really, I guess the best way to put it is it would be as if a spaniel attacked a Great Dane. But the 2 ships went at it for nearly an hour before the other 3 ships of the flying squadron joined in the battle at 1900. Now, the reason that they caught the Revolutionnaire was because the Revolutionnaire's captain wanted to fight, and he had ended up lagging behind where he should have been in order to give the British an opportunity to capture or to fight him. After all, he had a big bad 110. The thing is that by 1800, Howe ended up signaling discontinue the action, and basically Bellerophon by that point was pretty much dismasted. Revolutionary was a wreck, but the flying squadron ended up breaking off the fight with the Revolutionnaire, and the Revolutionnaire crawled off to return to Brest. They didn't stop immediately. They finally broke off at about 2000. Revolutionnaire is out of the fight. Bellerophon is pretty much out of the fight. However, the 2 fleets are still in sight of each other. So the battle resumes the next morning at 7:30. Now, remember, this is the high North Atlantic in late May, early June, and we're getting pretty close to to midsummer. So you've got daylight a real long time. Sun probably came up at 5:30. So both sides were heavily involved in the fighting. This time the French held the weather gauge, but the British were moving to get ahead of the French and gain the weather gauge. Both ships had fewer ships. Both fleets had fewer ships due to damage from the previous day. So a day-long battle ensues. Howe ordered his fleet to wear in succession. Caesar is the lead ship in order to cross the French rear. Now, the rear of a sailing ship was the most vulnerable part. Had Howe been able to do that, the French fleet would have been in pretty bad shape. Finally, about 10 a.m., the British van and the French rear start exchanging fire. Guerriere realizes what Howe's going to do, and he orders the fleet to wear in succession and double back. And the French fleet finally turns parallel to the British fleet, and that brings us to the next stage of the battle. The two fleets both have line of battle, and they're both heading in the same direction. The French, Howe orders his fleet to tack in succession to break the French line. The French turn together to close on the British. The problem is the lead two British ships, the Caesar and the Queen, are two of the most sluggish ships the British have. They cannot tack. They're afraid that their captains are afraid that the ships will go into iron and end up stalled, motionless during the middle of the battle. So instead of tacking, which is turning into the wind, they wear, which is turning away from the wind. Essentially, instead of turning 90 degrees to port, you're turning 270 degrees to starboard to end up in the same, to get where you're going. The problem is this ends up causing the British van to fall into complete confusion. So what do you do if you're the British commander? What Howe did was he took Queen Charlotte, his flagship, and had it break the French line. Queen Charlotte was followed by the Leviathan and the Bellerophon, which had ended up by this point fixing its damage. The British rear ends up engaging the two afterships of the French line, at which point they're isolated and being threatened. So now it's Villeroy-Joyeuse's turn. He takes Montague out of line, doubling back to guard his French ships. The French close on the Queen. British van moves to protect the Queen. Sounds like a game of chess at this point. The Tyrannicide, which has been dismasted during the battle, is towed out of danger. And finally, the French yield the weather gauge. They run downwind, pretty much beginning to break off the battle. Now, at this point, the French are still heading west. The convoy has passed them by this point. They know the convoy is south of them. So now what Villeroy-Joyeuse is doing is trailing his coat, getting the British to follow him further west as the convoy moves east. There was bad weather over the next 2 days, on the 30th and 31st of May. So neither side can engage. They know where the enemy fleet is, but nobody wants to start a battle in the teeth of a storm. Meanwhile, the convoy slips past the British, and you finally end up getting a battle on the 1st of June, and it proves to be an overwhelming British victory. And these next three charts show what happened. Basically, the two fleets were in line of battle. The French have slightly more ships than the British. Howe, at this point, has pretty much gotten the measure of the French fleet. And he realizes that if you push them hard enough, that they will collapse, that they're fine as long as you're in a set-piece battle. But once you have the French captains having to think for themselves, Howe realizes they don't have enough experience to really act effectively. So he orders his fleet to approach and really to break the line. And this was the first time that was a strategy since the Battle of the Santes in, I think, 1873. Normally the fleet actions were fought with the two sides in line of battle close to each other, battering each other until one side or the other ran away and you took prizes from the ones that were the most badly damaged. Howe didn't want to do that. He wanted the whole thing. By midday, the British had ended up breaking the French line in several places. And you can see how closely they were engaged. Finally, at the end of the day, the French ships that were able to break away did and sailed away. The British were left with 6 prizes. They had also managed to sink a French ship of the line. Now, that was extremely unusual, but the two ships that were engaged were tightly locked with each other, and the British simply started firing their guns downward and literally blew out the bottom of the French ship of the line. It was a celebrated battle by the French, even though they lost, which could go a long way towards explaining why the French rarely won naval battles, because they celebrated their defeats more than they celebrated their victories. But the thing is that the French advertised that their men had, this was the duel between the Brunswick and the Vengeur du People, and the French claimed that the crew had died to a man rather than surrender their ship. In actuality, the British captured 250 members of the crew, including the captain and the captain's son, who was one of his officers. So, but, as I said, the French fleet ended up getting completely smashed in this battle. So what happens after that? The next day, at the end of the day, Howe ends up having to spend 2 days repairing his ships and securing his prizes. And from there, he ends up sailing back to Portsmouth. He ended up reaching Portsmouth on 13 June. However, he sent his most badly damaged ships into Plymouth, basically so that, he didn't want any of them to sink, and let's get them into a sheltered port. Joyeuse Villaret and the French fleet ended up straggling into Brest on 8 June. Montague had been off Ushant. He had missed the convoy. And at this point, he ends up getting chased away from Ushant by the French combination of the French fleet that was coming back in from the battle and the French ships that were in Brest. He ended up sailing to Plymouth, reaching it on June 12th. So what happened to the convoy? Well, they were just moving across the Atlantic in a steady pace. Now, you can see where the battle was fought on the on 28 May. The convoy was within visual range of the British fleet at that point. However, the French fleet was between the British and the convoy, so the only thing the British saw were the masts of the French fleet. They couldn't see the convoy behind it. And number 3 is where the battle was fought on May 29th. And by this point, the convoy has fallen behind the two fleets. The next day, the French start heading west, and the British fleet follows them. And now the British fleet are between the French fleet and the convoy. But the weather's bad, so they miss the convoy. Finally, number 5, the convoy passes the wreckage left by the 29 May battle. And everyone in the convoy is in a dither, but von Stabel, who's commanding it, decides that his safest course is to just continue on to France. And although he is advised to double back, he doesn't. He continues on. And you can see where the battle was fought, number 6, where the battle was fought in 1 June. By this point, the British are well away from the convoy. Von Stabel wasn't sure what was waiting for him off of Brest. So he made landfall at the Penmarks, which is well south of Brest. And finds out, are there any British between me and between his ships and the port? No, there aren't. So he sails the convoy through the Ross Descent, which is a fairly narrow channel. Convoy reaches Bethune Bay and then finally Brest. And it arrives safely. It loses one ship, and that one was lost to hazards of the sea in a storm. So results of the campaign: British sank or captured 7 ships, French ships of the line, and took 1 French frigate. This was the biggest British victory really since the 7 Years' War. It was a bigger victory than the Santes, and that was a pretty big victory. The French managed to capture 1 British frigate, the Castor. Ironically, Thomas Trowbridge and most of his crew were aboard one of the French ships that fought at Battle of the 1st of June, and that ship was captured, which meant that Trowbridge and his men were freed, and they were the ones that sailed the French ship of the line to England. So the food convoy arrived safely at Brest, and both sides claimed victory. And in a very real way, both sides did win the victory they wanted. Afterwards, both all of the admirals were showered with accolades and awards and promotions. Howe and Joly Villaret ended up having long careers. I'm sorry, that should be Villaret Joyeuse in their navies. What's interesting is one of the French ships that fought there was a British prize. It was the Sans Pariel. It ended up serving in the Royal Navy until 1897 as a Royal Navy ship. The picture shows it in the 1840s or 1850s. So I think that's it. Yep. Okay.
Well, thank you, Mark. That's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
So are there any questions? Gee, that was almost exactly an hour. I'm impressed.
Yeah. Your timing's perfect. Maybe there's 1 or 2 questions before you depart, if that's all right. Does anyone have any questions for Mark while we have him here?
I'm sorry?
I had 1 question for you, Mark. Sure. Lord Howe, he was awarded, I think he got a personal visit from the King. King George
Yes.
came down and saw him and gave him a diamond. I can't remember. It was a neck, some sort of medallion or something of that nature, and a sword, I think. And
Yes.
this was apparently a very unique thing for the King to actually come and presented something like that to an admiral. and it never happened with Nelson. So why Howe and not Nelson? Why do you think?
Because Howe survived his battle.
There were a few there were a few battles before with Nelson.
Right.
Won
Well,
magnificent
no,
victories,
if you
but he never
think
got
about
anything
it,
like that.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, let's take a look at Nelson's victories. Okay, he ended up fighting, being the engine of victory at Battle of St. Vincent, but he wasn't in charge of that fleet. The next major battle he fought, fleet action, was the Nile, but he remained in the Mediterranean after that battle. He didn't get back until months later. Now, remember Howe has sailed into Portsmouth with a smashing British victory, the first major victory of the war. There'd been a number of unsatisfactory actions fought off the French Atlantic coast and the French Mediterranean coast. And yes, the British had captured Toulon by that point, but they had also lost it. So the whole thing is that the 1st of June was a victory that the British really badly needed by that point. And, how the king visits Howe literally, within a month of the battle. So that's part of it. And finally, the second victory, third fleet action that Nelson was involved with was, of course, Copenhagen. And again, he was not in charge there. He ended up pressing the action. That was the one where he was ordered to break off the action and he ignored the order. If anyone, the problem was, according to the rules, what should have been the commanding admiral that got the gold crusted sword from King George, and that wasn't Nelson. Plus, it was a big victory, but there were some political considerations. So, had Nelson survived Trafalgar, King George would have come down and given him probably a jewel-encrusted sword worth 2,000 pounds. But that's just circumstances didn't work out for him.
Any other questions that you'd like to raise with Mark?